Hi there to the History A-level students who are watching this video. We're looking at civil rights in the USA, and in particular this topic is coming under trade union and labour rights. And as you can see, the video is going to be about why were unions still struggling in the 1920s. If we just go back a stage, we need to just summarise where we're at before the 1920s starts. So we can say this: by the start of World War I, it would seem that little had been achieved in terms of the trade union and labour rights movement. There had been some progress from 1865. For example, union membership had grown to over 2 million workers, and unions had begun to put pressure on candidates in elections to support workers' rights. However, this progress is minimal. There was far more stalemate or a lack of progression since 1865. For example, for the non-agricultural workforce, unions only represented 20% of workers. 80% were unrepresented. Many industries, significant industries such as the steel and car manufacturing industry, had no union representation at all by the start of World War I. For those unions that did exist, many were not legally recognised, and therefore they lacked real power over any decisions. We can also say that workers were divided. They weren't one coherent group. They were divided along the lines of ethnicity, skill between low-skilled and high-skilled jobs, and also divided on sex. This lack of unity was often exploited by employers. For instance, if a strike happened, they could easily reach out to another branch of the workforce, maybe of a different ethnicity, and seek to employ those people so that production was maintained. Any gains that were made were often limited, therefore, to white, male, skilled workers in between 1865 and 1914. By 1918, though, the First World War had resulted in some positive developments for workers. For instance, between 1914 and 1918, factory production increased by 35% due to the demands of the war that were placed on the American economy. In that sense, this led to some real improvements because real wages rose by 20% in this 4-year period. At the same time, employers agreed to an 8-hour working day, an issue that had come up way back in 1886 through the Haymarket Affair. It was also a time where the federal government recognised unions for the first time and were willing to negotiate with them through the National War Labour Board that was established at this time. Therefore, collective bargaining and the ability to join a union was recognised by employers. But it must be said, this was in return for a no-strike policy, i.e. you could belong to a union and we will collectively bargain with that union, but you cannot go on strike as that union. Therefore, we see union membership increase rapidly from 1916 to 1920, rising from 2.7 million up to 5 million by the start of the decade we're going to focus on. Now, on the surface, this seems quite positive, but it is or must come with a caveat. Rather than seeing this First World War period as a change in attitudes towards workers, you must see this as a practical solution during a time of war to ensure production levels were maintained. The federal government and employers were willing to make these concessions so that production levels were maintained, so that the war could still be fought, and so they were keen to allow some concessions for this to therefore continue, so that strikes were avoided. So this isn't a period where there is a change of attitudes. These gains must be seen as a practical solution during a time of war. This leads us to the 1920s, the focus of this video. In the years 1920 to 1929, both the number of strikes and the number of workers involved in strikes dropped significantly. Just have a look at this table for a moment. Pause the video if you need to appreciate what it's showing you. There are 4 general reasons for this lack of strike activity and a reduction in the number of workers involved in strikes. Firstly, as said, a rise in real wages after World War I continued. This meant workers were earning more relative to the price of goods, and so there was no need to strike. Secondly, there was also dramatic falls in unemployment during the 1920s. And so once again, the need to go on strike or fight for rights was lessened as more people were in work, and that work was able to afford them a better standard of living. Thirdly, there was also nativism. What we mean by that is we mean that workers in employment were quite suspicious of unions still, associating them with foreign ideologies or ideas like communism or anarchism. And so there was a considerable feeling that strikers and unions were in somehow anti-American. But the fourth reason is something called welfare capitalism. And it's this I'd like to focus on in just a moment. Now, the 1920s was certainly a period of economic boom for America. As we said, the period of the First World War saw some progress, but this was more due to necessity than a change in attitudes. Post-World War I, America enjoyed unprecedented levels of prosperity. This is the age of the flappers, of new dances like the Charleston. And in part, these levels of prosperity were due to high tariffs that were established, protecting American companies from foreign competition. As a result of this, mass production increased, but it also increased the wealth and power of employers. So, it's at this time where we see giant corporations starting to emerge, particularly in the car industry, with companies such as Ford or Chrysler. And as said, at the same time, nativism continued to associate unions with communists and anarchists, undermining their effectiveness. At the same time, in the 1920s, the ideas of welfare capitalism start to emerge, and this limited industrial unrest. Think back to that table where there's a reduction in the number of strikes and a reduction in the number of workers involved in strikes in this decade. When we say welfare capitalism, we mean this. We mean a policy followed by employers in the 1920s to reduce industrial unrest by offering improved working conditions and other benefits in return for the establishment of unions under the control of the employer. In practice, welfare capitalism meant that, well, employers might improve working conditions like reducing hours, offering better pay, offering insurance plans or pension plans, providing recreational facilities for workers. However, this was done with a reason. This was done because this meant that in return, company unions were set up. and these did not have the power to negotiate wages or call strikes. So employers offered these concessions, but in return, they denied people the right to go on strike. This was summed up in 1921 by a union leader who described this practice as yellow dog contracts. This is a derisory term, and it describes a contract that prevented a worker from joining a union, and employers justified this by pointing to the welfare capitalism initiatives that they provided. Why would you go on strike, would be their argument, if we're giving you reduced hours and better pay? So if you want to work for us, you have to sign a contract that says you won't join a union. Perhaps one of the most famous proponents of this policy was Henry Ford. Henry Ford exerted a tight control over his workforce, and it would take until 1941 before he recognised any form of collective bargaining from a union in his company. Let's give you some positives and some negatives from this example from the Ford Motor Company. Henry Ford in the 1920s and beforehand, as early as 1914, did make some concessions. For example, he reduced the length of the working day to 8 hours. At the same time, he also doubled the daily wage of his workers to $5 a day. A huge amount in the context of the 1910s and 1920s. He even went as far as to start a profit-sharing scheme with his workers as well. This is an example of welfare capitalism in action. But as we said, this was done with ulterior motives. So for instance, one of the negatives was that Henry Ford, by offering these hours, wages and profits, also demanded control. Ford had its own protection department. These were employed security men who would watch over the workforce and look to spot any potential union activity or union organisation. This often led to violence because any workers associated with that or suspected of that could be intimidated or even assaulted. As we said before then, the Ford Motor Company did not recognise any union for collective bargaining until 1941, therefore. This is an excellent example of welfare capitalism in action. Employers making concessions, but in return not acknowledging or not allowing or even violently stopping union activity or organisation in their company. I'd like to finish the 1920s by thinking about a case study. This involves the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. These porters worked for the Pullman Coach Company. Have a look at some of these pictures just to give you an idea of what we mean. Many of those working as porters for the Pullman Company were African American. And they worked on these trains in the Pullman coaches, serving predominantly white customers. On the surface, this was an excellent job. However, in reality, there were some quite stark problems. Firstly, the porters working for the Pullman Company relied on tips for most of their income. This was hugely humiliating. Largely, that's because all of them were referred to as George, after the founder of the company, George Pullman. So if you were on a Pullman train or in a Pullman coach and you had a porter, you would call him George, no matter what his real name was. 10% of their time was also unpaid. When setting up and when cleaning up, Pullman coach porters were not paid for these duties. So 10% of their working day was unpaid effectively. They also had to pay for their own food, lodgings and uniforms, and this could account to up to 50% of their wages. Fifthly, if a passenger stole an item, or even by mistake took one with them, it was the porter that had to foot the cost of that replacement. There was also no promotion. The next level up in the Pullman coach company from being a porter was to be a conductor, but you had to be white to be able to do this. And then lastly, they did get a perk because they could travel at half fare rates on their days off, but the catch was this: they were not allowed to travel in Pullman coaches. They had to travel in other parts of the train. So the position of porters working for the Pullman company was not as good as it seemed. We're now going to finish by looking at four things. We're going to look at the attitudes of African American workers in regards to the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, but also in regards to union activity generally. We're going to look at the leadership of Asa Philip Randolph. We're going to think about the gains that are made by the BSCP. And we're going to think about Pullman's response to the BSCP. The first thing to say is this, is that African Americans were often estranged from organised labour. That's because many unions just did not allow them to join, but there was also great mistrust that whites and blacks had anything in common, and this was an attitude held by African Americans as well as white Americans. By the 1920s, though, this was changing as the Socialist Party of America and the Communist Party focused on black worker rights, a neglected subject until this point. Asa Philip Randolph was an academic and a member of the Socialist Party. On the 25th of August 1925, in a meeting in Harlem, New York, attended by about 500 porters, he was chosen as the leader of a new organisation, a new union, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, the BSCP. They had quite a provocative motto: fight or be slaves. The Pullman Coach Company's response to the setting up of this union was swift and negative. They denounced it and linked it to foreign ideologies, as we mentioned before. This is an example of nativism. They then sponsored their own company union, which they called the Pullman Porters and Maids Protective Association. Lastly, they also banned any meetings of the BSCP, and they had local authority assistance there from local government to break up these meetings. Despite this, the BSCP continued to fight for union representation and to argue and bargain with the Pullman Company for better worker conditions. But 3 years later, by 1928, they were still not recognised, even though half of all porters had signed up to the BSCP. By that point, some felt that strike action was needed, but Asa Philip Randolph disagreed with this and was very reluctant to start a strike. Eventually, the National Mediation Board, something you'll learn about soon, certified the union in June 1935, almost 10 years after its start. By 1937, therefore, they signed a collective bargaining agreement with the Pullman Company, and so finally the BSCP could negotiate with the Pullman Coach Company for the rights of African American porters, 12 years after its foundation.